welcome to the
I watched the Russian.
my opinion, one of the Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of the Brussels Signal podcast. It is my great pleasure to welcome Henry Olsen to the show. Mr. Olsen is currently a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He's also the author of two books. One was The Working Class Republican, Ronald Reagan and the Return of Blue-Collar Conservatism, and The Four Faces of the Republican Party, the fight for the 2016 presidential nomination. And I'm happy to say, Henry, if I recall correctly, you're also a podcaster yourself.
I do. I host a weekly American politics podcast called Beyond the Polls.
Well, then, in reference to your own podcast, Beyond the Polls, can you tell us a little bit what's currently going on in the United States? What's the state of the race? What's your feeling both in your gut and in your head where we're heading in the next 2 weeks?
For the last 10 days or so, the air has been slowly being let out of the Kamala Harris balloon. Her lead has dropped in all of the polling averages. Her lead is no longer what it was, and in many cases have been reversed in the key swing states, and the major forecasting sites all have Trump now a narrow favorite. There's nothing that suggests this is changing. Trump seems to be winning every day in the media, making better news, making more news, and the tea leaves that one reads when one is in Washington as to who is worried. You can begin to see the Democratic operatives talking to their friends in the media to send whatever message they want to send to try and get the campaign back on track. There's 2 weeks to go before Election Day. In a race this close, anything can happen, and of course events matter. But right now it looks like it's slipping away from Harris, although it is still not a race any reasonable prognosticator should call with any degree of certainty.
Now, you mentioned election day, but if we're honest, do the United States really have an election day or do they have an election season? Because if I remember correctly, in some states you had early voting that began on September 26th. Now, in your view, does this make sense? I mean, I know the United States, particularly when it comes to their political system, are actually very keen on their traditions. But do you think that to some extent this is a problem if you have voting going on in states almost 2 months before the actual election is taking place?
Well, this is more of a hypothetical problem than a real problem. Yes, one could vote that early, but almost nobody did. As of the date when you and I are talking, about 19.6 million votes have been received by various entities. That's about 13% of the expected turnout, and we're 2 weeks ahead of election. And most people believe that most of that has come in the last 10 days. Again, about 10 days ago, it was 5 million. So people took advantage of it, and it is an election season, but it's really much more of people taking advantage of it in the final 2 weeks than the mass of Americans voting 8 weeks before an election and then just going off on holiday.
What do you think is behind the Trump story? I mean, it's an amazing comeback story if you think like he became president entirely unexpectedly in 2016. Then he had, I would say, 3 good years before Corona hit. Then after he lost the election to Joe Biden, you had, of course, January 6th in January of 2021. And for a while, everybody thought he was done, right? It's over. Then he climbed his way back to once again cling the Republican nomination. And now, as you say, the race is so close that it's too soon to tell what's going to happen, but there is a realistic chance, and particularly over the last couple of days, it seems that the race is going into his direction. Just kind of in your personal opinion, like kind of if you take off your analyst's hat and kind of just take on your opinionators, your commentator's hat, what do you think explains this comeback? I mean, it's an American story, but it's something that probably nobody would have believed possible just 3.5 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to find a comparison. Probably in the world, the closest comparison is Lula in Brazil, but Lula in Brazil had won popular votes before. What characterizes Donald Trump as particularly interesting is that he wins because of our odd electoral college system. He has never won a popular vote. He does not look like he's going to win the popular vote this time. He's going to win because we select our presidents by a system weighting state power by the number of senators and members of the lower house that they have. And his coalition is particularly powerful in high profile states that deliver a lot of electoral votes. What explains the comeback? I think part of what explains the comeback is, like any popular figure, he never lost a base. He always had a large number of people who loved him. I think the effort of the Biden administration and overzealous Democratic prosecutors to send him to jail solidified support among people who liked him outside of that base, who might have been willing to look elsewhere. And then, the fact is, he represents the new conservative populist supermajority in the Republican Party that is increasingly showing up in many developed countries. You take a look at France, and if they had a binomial system like ours, as opposed to the multi-party system that they have, the Les Républicains would have disappeared because they would have lost all their primary battles to national rally. That's effectively what Donald Trump has done, is win the Republican Party primary, because about 60% to 2/3 of the voters nationally, and a much larger percentage of that in many of the states, like conservative populism. And so once he reestablished himself as the champion of conservative populism, in part aided by his adversaries, he became the Republican Party's choice. And then you have the Biden administration. The fact is, he wouldn't have a chance if they were even decently liked. But Joe Biden is going into this election having either the lowest or one of the lowest job approval ratings of any first-term American president since the Second World War. And it's really hard to ask voters to give your party a second chance when your voters would prefer to toss you out in your ear. And so this combination of factors is why Trump personally was able to stay in the game and reestablish dominance in the Republican Party, and then have a shot at winning the presidency again.
I mean, he obviously is a populist, but you mentioned conservative populism, this very specific brand of populism. But isn't Donald Trump the most likely ambassador of that kind of ideology? A man who is, multiple divorces, a TV show host, somebody who was very well received up until he started his political career in liberal democratic circles in New York. So he was not the kind of type you would look at and say, okay, this is going to be a populist, yes, but he was not the kind of person you looked at and say it's going to be a conservative populist in many ways. So how do you explain, exactly as you just said, his appeal, particularly at the Republican base, that really, as you said, they have a loyalty towards him that I don't think we've seen on the political right in the United States since Ronald Reagan, or maybe even earlier. I mean, one of the things that makes Trump so fascinating is that he, in some areas like abortion, could afford to take a much more liberal position than other Republicans because his base is so loyal to him. Yeah. If you look at this, what do you think about this?
First of all, when Trump ran in 2016 for the Republican nomination, he was not the choice of the Republican base. The Republican base wanted Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas. He acquired the loyalty of the base by governing much more to the right than anybody expected, adopting conservative priorities on abortion, adopting conservative priorities on tax cuts and deregulation and anti-environmental. And he always had conservative priorities on immigration. And he adopted a tough guy stance in the world. Foreign policy experts can pick holes here and there, but for the average Republican voter, he seemed to be a strong man who stands up to his enemies and to America's enemies. And that is something that the conservative base wants. If he were to be apostate entirely on abortion, say, well, I'm not only not going to sign, I'm going to veto a national abortion ban, but I now think abortion should be legal, and I'm going to go with the other side and push a national, overturn Roe versus Wade legislation. Well, then they'd abandon him. If he said, I'm no longer for tax cuts, but I'm actually for tax hikes for everybody, well, then they'd abandon him. But what he does is he adopts, and this is what populists in Europe need to understand, is that factions never get 50%. Factions always have to be the dominant group within a wider coalition. And what Trump effectively did was say, okay, and this is where his self-proclaimed expertise as a deal maker came in, he instinctively understood he needed to make deals to broaden his coalition. And so he adopted conservative priorities in areas where they didn't um, deprecate his populist bona fides. This time he's going to govern more as an economic populist. And that seems to be okay with the bases because they're willing to make deals that maybe they weren't willing to make 8 years ago, but they're willing to make now. That's where the majority comes in. And that's the sort of thing that Viktor Orban does is in Hungary, which is that he is somebody who embraces conservatism in all of its forms, markets, but not as an ideology, but as a matter of practice. He's a social conservative. He's a populist. He creates a coalition that, in a majoritarian system, allows him to govern. And that's basically what Donald Trump does. Is he is a populist, but also has strongly non-populist conservative elements in his coalition. He needs them to govern in a majoritarian system. In non-majoritarian systems and PR systems, you need to be able to enter into coalition with those parties, which is what populists in Sweden and Norway and Finland and Denmark have done over the last decade or so. It's always a balancing act of being true and expanding your influence, but also understanding you're never going to have 50% of the vote purely from your faction. So you have to find friends who agree with you 70% of the time, rather than call them enemies.
Do you think that part of his appeal is also his authenticity? I mean, it's fascinating to observe. Like, if you look at the different types of politicians you have in the United States, so you have the kind of classic career politicians like Joe Biden, like Kamala Harris. And then you have Donald Trump, again, the TV show host, the reality TV star, which is probably the least authentic thing in the world. But when you look at how they present themselves as politicians, we saw it now recently, which drove parts of the left-leaning media crazy, when Donald Trump was working for 50 minutes to half an hour in a McDonald's, right? I think in Pennsylvania, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
But he seems authentic doing it. Like, you look at him, like, and you can stage things. Of course, it's a photo op. I mean, nobody really expected that he's now going to start taking up a job at McDonald's. But the way he does it, the way he interacts with people also at his rallies, one has the impression that this is who Donald Trump is. Like, he's not Rolodexing. He's not looking at people and say, okay, what did the last focus group say that I have to say to this specific group of people I'm currently talking to? So do you think that this is also part of the success story of Donald Trump, that he's more authentic than the supposedly authentic politicians that he runs against?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things in the United States, and it's increasingly one of the bad features of American modern politics that gets exported overseas, is the idea that you can use data analytics and message focusing to basically hit the right message all the time and be a modern version of Machiavelli's chameleon prince, always being able to show the right image at the right time. The problem is you can't do that in real life. You can't be that way. You actually every person has a core, and to try and be that makes you look like exactly what you are trying not to look like, which is somebody who is pandering. And most modern politicians look that way because they're not willing to actually, and they're not able to actually think on their feet to answer questions directly, but without appearing to be inauthentic. Earlier generations of politicians knew how to present their core image while also understanding not everyone shares that core image. The modern technological politician, in the pursuit of the perfection of always having the core image, lost, or the perfect image for the moment, lost the ability to project their core image. And Donald Trump has that core image. He returns to it again and again. He is innately comfortable in front of a camera. The fact that he's spent his entire life as much as a marketer, as a builder, shows that he knows innately how to attract and hold an audience. And for his most fervent followers, the things that drive his critics crazy are actually things that validate him in front of them. They want to dramatically change the system. Most of the people in the media and in these institutions, of course, benefit from the system. They don't want to change They don't want to get off the gravy train. That's just human nature. So when Donald Trump does things that make them howl, that reinforces his credibility with the people who actually would like to make the elites howl. And one of the things that is a endemic feature of modern life is how much, I would say 15 to 18 years after this populist era started, elites in virtually every capital or transnational capital, like with Brussels, refuse to understand what's going on. It's not that they can't understand. It's not that they don't understand. It's now to the point where they refuse to understand. And yet they continue to get steamrolled because the people want something different and they're not getting it from the people who purport to want to rule for them.
I mean, you also mentioned the media, and one of the things, and I know polls are always to be taken with a grain of salt, but one of the things that you saw in the case of Donald Trump is that he's very often depicted as this Nazi-esque figure. I think Anne Applebaum recently wrote an article in The Atlantic where she says, and I'm paraphrasing now, I'm quoting from memory, but she mentions all three of them in the title, but it's like, Trump speaks like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. So it's like she's not, it's not just he's just Hitler or Stalin. He's like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini all rolled into one. But given the fact that he apparently is this fascist, racist, reactionary, you name it, whatever the worst term is that you could think of, he seems with every election he runs in to make inroads with minorities, with the African American community, with the Latino community. So what does that tell us about the media, the way the media looks at these minorities, and how these minorities, if we can say so, look at themselves within the American political system?
Yeah, I mean, let's not overstate it. Donald Trump is going to lose, likely lose. The Trump campaign believes it will win Latinos, but we'll see on election day. They just likely lose Latinos if you believe the bulk of polling data, public polling data. But he is doing better. And what's quite clear is that large minorities of those voters do not see him in the way that the largely white college and often graduate school educated self-appointed pundits and poets, priests, and priestesses tell us he is. And the fact is, anybody who at this point continues to see populism in such hackneyed and incorrect terms as fascist and racist are people who simply are choosing not to listen. They're choosing to be inaccurate. They're choosing to be like the conservatives of a century ago who called, social democrats communists. And yes, that's an exaggeration that can be used for political effect. But so many people actually believe it then, a century ago and now, that it's quite clear that they choose not to see the truth and consequently blind themselves to the possibilities of offering a better future for the people. So if people get to choose between a force that they think is largely on their side, but may not be perfect, and a group that is obtusely ignorant, they'll choose the people that's largely on their side. They don't want to be ruled by ignoramuses who think that they are stupid and ignorant.
But if we can just stick to this topic a little longer, because exactly what you just said, I mean, these are, at least on paper, intelligent people, like whether it's Timothy Snyder or Anne Applebaum or the editorial board of the New York Times. Let's call it educated people, if you want. So as you say, do you think, and that's and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but do you think that they're entirely convinced of what they're writing and saying, or that they do so because, as you mentioned before, that in fact they are the Praetorian Guard of the existing system and they just want to prevent change at any cost possible? I mean, I was thinking about this. There was the famous L. Smith dinner just a couple of days back, where Donald Trump, some jokes are very harsh, but I think his writers did a fairly good job, where he was teasing Chuck Schumer, who was sitting right next to him while he was holding his speech. Now, if Chuck Schumer would really think that Trump is the next Hitler, he would not attend such an event with him. So is a lot of this, is it, and this is also something that people, both minorities and non-minorities, that they feel that they say, you use this language because you think we're stupid. Like, we do know that you don't really think that Trump is a fascist, that you're just saying this because you think then you can blackmail us into either not voting for him or voting for you.
I would say it always depends on the person. I think there are people who honestly believe it, not that they know the slightest bit what fascism actually was. For them, it's since World War II, it has in the United States and I think in many other places been the epithet from the center left and the left to delegitimize conservatives and people on the right. And then there are people who are using it for effect. But again, if you take these people's, it's like when they say, well, Donald Trump and Republicans are against democracy, but that's completely ridiculous. The pieces of evidence that they adopt or the arguments that they adopt that democracy must have would disqualify every country in Western Europe, because there's no country in Western Europe that has the ridiculously open voting system that exists in the United States. So if you have to believe in same-day registration and early voting and mail voting without showing ID and so forth and so on in order to be democratic, there is no democratic country other than the United States. But of course, they'll never say that, which just goes to show how absurd the claim is. But yeah, there are people who honestly believe that Donald Trump, when in office, will end democracy. But the fact is, since he won't, at most he's going to stretch executive power in ways that the American system will find difficult to contain. But that's not the end. As I like to say to people here in America, you end democracy by ending democracy. Ending democracy means shooting or imprisoning your enemies. It means silencing the ability of your adversaries to speak in public without threats of death or retaliation. It means exiling people. It means it means ending democracy. And it's not going to happen in this country. It's just not.
One of the things that we hear a lot is that people lose trust in institutions. We hear it in Europe, we hear it in the United States, that the democracy, that's one of the reasons why quote-unquote democracy is in crisis. But do you believe it is fair to say that we also tend to sometimes overestimate the role of institutions, but we also tend to underestimate their resilience? I'm always wondering, let's say Donald Trump becomes president, and 4 years from now he says, I'm not going to leave the White House, and I call upon the US Army or the National Guard to, surround the White House and protect me from being deposed from power. I mean, this would not happen, right? I assume that the Joint Chief of Staff, that the heads, that the governors of the states, they simply would not do this. I think the same was true, and I don't want to get on thin ice here, but I think how horrible, and it was, no doubt about this, January 6th was. But the American institutions were not on the brink of being overthrown. So I think that there was, and correct me if you see it differently, but I think there was no real chance that the US military would have sworn an oath on the horned guy who marched through the Capitol. That sometimes we weaken institutions by describing them as weaker than they actually are. The American system, for all its flaws, like all the political systems around the world, seems to me much more resilient than people give it credit.
It was never, I am not a fan of what happened on January 6th. I think what happened on January 6th was horrible. It was terrible. It was an affront to democratic values. I do not think that there was any legitimate reason for Donald Trump to complain about that election and the attempt to try and get Vice President Pence to unilaterally open a controversy where there was substantively not one, was at best reckless. But there was never a risk that democracy. I mean, here's the thing: is what would happen if, somehow, Donald Trump had succeeded? Does anybody believe that the Democratic Party would have turned around and said, "Oh well, I guess we lost"? No, they would have filed suit in court. Does anybody believe that a court system that had uniformly rejected every single one of Trump's claims would have accepted this one? Now, there are Democrats who believe that Republicans are a malign conspiracy, basically a crime family, and that they would have turned around and said, oh yeah, of course we're going to do that. But then you have to explain, why is it that not a single Republican legislative leader in the run-up to January 6th went along with what Trump was asking him to do? Not a single one. Why would suddenly everybody turn around and attack? It is the sort of script that if somebody submitted it to Hollywood, it would be rejected for being too boring and too unrealistic. But yet it is a commonly held fantasy here. January 6th was awful. It was a disgrace to watch my one of the two national temples of our republic desecrated by a rampaging mob. But democracy was not going to fall. The institutions held, the individuals held, and they would have held afterwards, and they will hold during the Trump administration as well.
So it seems a little bit, as you just mentioned, sometimes it seems the rhetoric from both sides is a little bit overblown. I mean, I'm sure that politicians always have a desire to hold on to power, but as you just mentioned, it's there are these layers of institutions. And another thing that surprised me, of course, on January 6th is whatever one thinks about the United States, but if there should ever be a coup, that it's going to be unarmed in the land of the Second Amendment is also something that strikes me as highly unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, let's not exaggerate the type of weaponry people have here. People may have automatic weapons; they don't have howitzers and anti-tank guns and so forth. This isn't like there's this subterranean Ukrainian army that can stand up to a serious military force. There's not going to be a coup in the United States. There's not going to be an informal coup. There's not going to be a formal coup. The United States has no national identity apart from its form of government. We are unique in the world in that. We are not an ethnos. We are not religiously unified. We have nothing in common except our republic. Take that, and we have nothing. No, it's not going to happen.
Do you think that one of the problems that the American system currently has is that there is a kind of incentive structure that makes it very difficult for maybe the kind of politician that you and I and others would like to see in politics? That it's structured in a way that it attracts people that have a personality profile. Let's call it this. That is not necessarily the kind of person, let's say, that you would hand your child over in a metaphorical sense. Do you think that there is a selection problem in the way in which politicians rise to the top at the moment, that then you end up with either career politicians or this almost dynastic systems? I always have to think back to 2016 when the ideal case, it seemed to me, from the perception of the established political systems, was it should have been Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton, which seemed more like the competition between two dynastic families in an old European monarchical style than that of a free republic.
Yeah. There's a lot of problems with American politics. Our open primary system, where voters, not party leaders or paid party members, select the nominees, means that it's a very fluid and open system. There's advantages to that, and there are disadvantages to that. What I will say is that quality people do enter politics. They do rise very high, very fast. J.D. Vance is an amazingly smart person who is becoming an amazingly good politician in a rapid time. And he could never have risen so fast in a parliamentary system. This is a guy who 3 years ago was not elected, and if Donald Trump wins, will be a heartbeat away from the presidency at the age of 40. Your systems don't permit that. Our systems do, and there are there are bad things that flow from such openness, and there are good things. Abraham Lincoln going from losing office, having no elected office, to the presidency of the United States. Ronald Reagan going from being an actor to being the governor of California 2 years later and the president of the United States 14 years later. Our openness produces weird incompetence, and it produces highly unorthodox statesmanship. And the question is what mix you have at the time, and I think America is beginning to tilt towards its traditional approach, which is unorthodox statesmanship coming up through our highly unorthodox open system.
So would it be fair to paraphrase Mark Twain and say that the rumors of the death of American democracy are greatly exaggerated?
Absolutely. American democracy isn't going anywhere, no matter how much it will be under strain over the next few years, because, again, it is America. America has no identity apart from a republic. You cannot separate it from its form of government, and people will not contemplate taking up arms against that government. What you would have in the worst case scenario is a slow squeezing of political rights of people. a building up barriers against a victorious party being able to be voted out. But the idea that the United States of America, with 50 states and 5,000 independent and independently armed police agencies with 400 million and counting guns in private hands, plus the loyalty of its citizens, the idea that somehow this is all going to be cast aside in some sort of quick, sudden way justifies everything we know about the American character and about the American system of government.
If we take a look in the metaphorical crystal ball, whoever wins the election in early November, what do you think will be the biggest challenges for then the new president and the newly formed Congress? What do you think are the things that that they can no longer further push down the road, whether it's domestically or internationally? What do you see as the first great obstacles and challenges to
There's
whoever's
things
going to
that
be
I
in
don't
office?
think they should push down the road, but never underestimate the ability of politicians to push things down the road. Look, the United States faces a mismatch between its international obligations and its international relative power. That power is not absolute. The ability to exert economic power, the ability to exert particularly military power is relative. The relative power of the United States vis-a-vis its large adversaries is shrinking. We're still the most powerful nation in the world, but the relative advantage is shrinking militarily and economically. And if one wants to maintain the American uh, international alliance system without triaging, which is to say, saying that some areas are going to be secondary in importance, it must rebuild its military rapidly. It does not have the military force to simultaneously combat China, combat Russia, and combat Iran. And everybody knows it. Of course, it's not clear that those countries have the ability to simultaneously push on three directions. So it moves in two directions. But so that's the first thing they shouldn't punt on. The second thing they shouldn't punt on is our rapidly rising national debt. We've been borrowing massive sums to sustain consumption for decades, but particularly in the last 15 years. We need to get a handle on this, and that means we need to tax ourselves for the things that we value, and we need to stop spending on the things that we don't. But again, I think that's a sort of, one of the things, Americans are relatively less taxed than other places, but we also spend a lot of money on the rich. Giving them tax breaks that don't exist in other countries, giving them pensions that are less generous in other countries, subsidizing their institutions in ways that boggle the mind. That's another thing we should do, but probably may not. The third thing is the hardest thing, but it's the most important thing, which is that Americans every 40 years or so need to redefine its creed. Because we are a nation that was founded at a specific time, we have specific founding documents that always come into the debate about when things get tough. Who is the real interpreter of America? We need a reinterpretation that can break this polarized binomial battle of values. And that's why people are fearful of the other side, because they really are fearful, not just of the personality of Trump. And you saw this in the attack on, the not physical attack, but the protest about Justice Kavanaugh in 2018. There's no sense that Justice Kavanaugh was a threat to democracy, but he was a threat to the way of life of and the views of the progressives. So they treated him as awfully as they treat Donald Trump. There has to be an answer to this, and that has to come from statesmanship in the presidency. And that's the most pressing thing, but it's the thing I think that is least likely to get handled in this presidency. I think it's going to require more confrontation before somebody has the ability and the mandate to step in and say, it is time for us to answer the question that Americans have wanted us to answer, which is how can we move into the next century while being authentically American, while recognizing we are no longer the British Protestant Commonwealth of the past.
What seems to me as one of the most quintessential experiences of American democracy or the American historical development is this idea that the states are small laboratories of democracy, of political experimenting. And you can go as far left as New York and California, and then you can swing rightwards like Florida did. Do you think that the argument that is very often being made that the presidency is, if we look at this through the lens of how the founding fathers might would have viewed it, that the presidency has actually become too important, that it's an office that has slowly but surely kind of expanded into areas and for example, what the president is talking about childcare, the president is talking about forgiving student loan debt. So all things that a George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or or the main minds, Thomas Paine behind the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, that would have probably struck them as very odd that you get rid of a king to create then a persona that is in power very similar to a king.
Well, it's not similar to a king in that it is not hereditary and it is not arbitrary. What the American founders wanted to do was ensure that power, when it is used, comes as a result of open debate and open choice by the people. It would be power, but it would not be arbitrary power. But the founders had two things that we no longer seem to believe. One is they believed that the primary goal of the national government was to do national things, and those were defined primarily as handling relations militarily and foreign policy and economically with other countries, and occasionally doing things with common territory, like when we expanded, when we have new territory that isn't populated enough, they don't automatically become states. They have to be populated and then be admitted into the Union, and Congress can govern those territories under our Constitution. The other thing is there was a much smaller view about what government ought to do. But this makes sense in a world where communication is virtually non-existent in an instantaneous way. Communication is extremely expensive in a world where there are no corporations, because corporations were not a matter of right. So they were a matter of legislative purview or largesse, where 80 to 90% of the people were self-sufficient farmers and there was no national economy. Of course, the federal government, the national government isn't going to do very much. What happens is that things change, and what people realize is that it's very difficult to have 50 independent states regulating these things that states would normally regulate and maintain some sort of national economy. And then, of course, you have the question of rights, which is particularly after a civil war, there was a question of what rights do people have as citizen of the nation as opposed to citizens of the state. And so the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. There were things that the federal government could not do, but the states could do them, and if they chose. Massachusetts had an established religion until 1830 or 1831, even though that was forbade to the United States. So, there's two things. One is the question of what the government ought to do, and the second is the question of which government ought to do it. And one can imagine one splits the baby, but in some way there has to be a stronger national government now than there was in 1789 or in 1889, because the people won't stand for it in any other way. The question is, how does one accomplish this in a way so that it is more beholden to the people, less arbitrary, less centered on one person and one institution, and more centered. And this is one place where a parliamentary regime offers an option that may be more akin to what the founders envisioned. Where they used to have people who were senior members of Congress go in and out. You'd go into the executive branch and you serve in the cabinet, then you'd go back to the legislature. That never happens anymore. If you're a senior person going into the cabinet, that's basically your retirement from politics. But of course, that's not the way a parliamentary system would work. We have to sort these things out. The presidency is too important. The executive branch is too important. The national government is too important. But it can't go back to a system where the national government does little and the president is basically a head of state who can appoint customs agents and postmen.
Do you think that one of the things that maybe the founding fathers got wrong and that was maybe too much influenced by their time, I believe that one of the designs of the American Constitution was this idea to pitch ambition against ambition, faction against faction. And that maybe one thing they underestimated is that the modern type of politicians, with few exceptions, of course, the same I think is true in Europe as in the United States, that not everybody is necessarily so ambitious to attempt, if they could, to become a new king or to become a dictator, that many are actually very happy to be in office, to quote you, right, to be on the gravy train, if you want to use that expression, and actually push responsibility either to the president or to some, three-letter agency, and instead of trying to get more power, get rid of power, because thereby also getting rid of accountability, and have ideally, a nice cushion job, but without the ambition, so to speak, that the founding fathers were so concerned about.
Yeah, the thing to remember is that when the Constitution was written, there are no such things as political parties. That political parties are basically entities that were originally formed to standardize the brand, to use a marketing term, that you could know by this brand that this candidate supported this set of ideas. We call it a platform. It's called a manifesto, many other places. And it was an electoral mechanism. It was basically a way to ensure that whatever collection of factions found more in common with one another could succeed to convince masses of voters to adopt a particular way and have the technology and the resources to ensure or at least compete for victory. There was no such thing like that in 1787. Parties, to the extent that they thought of parties, were the sort of parties we had in the nascent parliaments in Europe, which is collections of individuals within parliaments, within legislative bodies, who would form alliances within those bodies, but would not wage campaigns as a united front with a united brand. And so once you move to that direction, this changes the whole relationship of the member to his constituents, to the member to the other people. Who's more powerful, the person who's elected or the person who gets the resources to ensure that others are elected? That's not something people ever thought about in 1787. And it has evolved over time into a system where the president is the most important person in the country, in the political world, not a dictator over the person's party. The president cannot determine who the next governor of California from there, if you're a Democrat, or the next governor of Texas is. There's still a sufficient degree of independence that that's not the case. But the whole creation of unified, or at least brand-centric political parties means that the question of faction and the question of what an incentive that a legislator who is ambitious for office and honors has to pursue is not the same. And it still matters. You do have the Senate fighting against the House institutionally. You do have people who care about the oil and gas interests fighting against another interest, which is all the things that Madison believed would procure and maintain liberty. But it's not, it is the existence of party loyalty. You go up or down with your party rather than who you are. It means it's an entirely different world. And then the other thing that I'd say is, if there's one thing the United States founders wanted to do, was make sure there would never be a religious war in America. And so you made religion a state matter. Ideally, you granted religious liberty so you would never have the tensions, and you made sure that the Congress could never basically pass a moral code. Well, that's no longer the case. We've nationalized rights. We've centered the interpretation of those rights in a non-elected Supreme Court, and we've said that there can be no deviation from those things. Well, we've basically created the sort of system that forces you into that, what I call binomial battle of values. You must be either X or Y to live your way of life. And this transforms faction. The whole point that Madison wanted to do was not have the rich versus the poor, or the Protestant versus the Catholic, but 50 different sects and 50 different, or 500 different sects and 500 different economic interests. Well, when you have this sort of concentration of power and so many decisions decided by a non-accountable body that affect everything that people care most about. You're forcing this binomial contest of values. There are alliances among progressive sides, but they are all on the Democratic side. And there are different aspects of conservative sides, but they're all on the Republican side. And this is something that the weakening of the founding system's guard on the expansion of national power and the weak expanded idea of rights has created the possibility of exactly the evil that Madison sought to eliminate, and the current Constitution does not have a remedy.
Well, on that note, Henry Olsen, thanks so much for joining us. I hope we can have you on again after the election. So I think we got a good preview of how the election is going to unfold from a technical perspective. Let's see what the results will be in 2 weeks. It was wonderful talking to you. Again, I highly recommend to all our listeners, check out Henry's podcast, Beyond the Polls. Check out his books, especially his writings on the blue-collar conservatism, which I think was very prescient when it comes to where the Republican Party stands today. And of course, for those who knew Henry longer, you were a former columnist for the Washington Post. I think your previous columns are always worthwhile going back to. And you're currently also writing for us, for Brussels Signal.
Yes.
So this is also something I ask everyone to check out. It's a wellspring of information, of insight. You'll be smarter after reading it, so I highly recommend it to everyone. Henry, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.